Welcome back to part 4.5 of the VQ35 build, and this part's going to be a little bit different, as I'm going to be addressing some things I want to go back and alter with this build so far. Now, a lot of what I'm covering here has to do with the bottom end of the engine. So the first thing I'm going to do is roll this engine back over, remove the upper and lower oil pans, and then basically start tearing this engine back apart. So first, I want to go back and address this upgraded Dynasty girdle I installed. Now, I discussed this back in part 4 that due to this being larger than the stock girdle, there is a clearance issue with the windage tray and the upper oil pan. At the time, I kind of brushed off the deletion of the windage tray, as others who have used this Dynasty girdle don't report oil starvation issues. However, there is a very specific reason I'm wanting to go back to a stock girdle and windage tray setup. See, this is a windage tray, and they're designed to help reduce the turbulent air generated by a spinning crankshaft. They help reduce what's called windage, which is the effect of wind or air turbulence on a moving object. The tray sits under the crankshaft and serves as a physical barrier to help accumulate that thrown off oil and helps deliver it more smoothly back down to the pickup. This helps reduce oil aeration, where the oil can become frothy with air, which can create small air pockets in the oil feed system, which is not really what you want in the oil delivery system of an engine. Now, the Dynasty girdle is good for much higher horsepower builds and primarily a good addition for drag racing applications. Now, I'm not interested in straight line power, and I want to go back to the windage tray setup in this, as I think it's going to be better suited for the type of performance I want out of this engine. So I am going to go ahead and pull this girdle out, but before that, I want to go back and address a mistake that I made in part 1 of this series. See, back when I was assembling the bottom end of this engine, I made a mistake in applying the stock torque specs used for main bolts and applied them to these new upgraded ARP main studs. To further explain this issue, I want to discuss the difference between bolts and studs and how they differ mechanically. See, this is a factory main bolt, and they're designed to be tightened to a specific torque and then have a 90 to 95 degree turn applied to them, which helps ensure a high accurate torque is achieved. These bolts are actually designed to stretch when those torques are applied, which again ensures a tight fit, but it will cause the bolt to lengthen. Studs also experience that stretch that occurs. However, because they differ mechanically in how that torque is applied, they don't experience the stretch to the same degree that bolts do. It is argued that because of the degree of stretching that bolts can experience, you really shouldn't reuse them in any type of rebuild, as that lengthening that can occur will cause the bolt to bottom out on a mating surface. As a result, there's a small amount of slack that is now present that will result in the two surfaces mating, but it will not ensure that a tight, accurate torque is achieved. This almost always results in the two surfaces being under-torqued when put together. Now, the biggest difference between bolts and studs is in how they differ in the mechanics of applying torque. Bolts apply torque by threading into a receiver piece, in this case the lower block, and are torqued pulling the main cap down, securing those two surfaces. As a bolt is tightened and turns into the receiver piece, it undergoes a vertical clamping force securing those two surfaces together. However, it also undergoes a twisting or rotational force as it's being threaded in. Now, I won't be pulling these main studs out, but I can still explain this using an exhaust stud as an example. Studs operate a bit differently, as they thread into and secure in the receiver piece, and they allow for the main cap to slide over the top. The torque then is applied to the nut at the top of the stud, and this secures those two mounting surfaces together, but it does away with the twisting or rotational force. Ultimately, the torquing force moves from being here in the bottom of the block and shifts here to the top of the main cap. As a result of this shift, studs are able to apply a more even distribution of a torque load across two mating surfaces and are considered more reliable. This difference in how torques are applied are why stock torque specs cannot be applied to these ARP main studs, and ultimately where this mistake occurred. See, back when I was assembling the bottom end of this engine, I shot an entire sequence measuring the main journal dimensions on the crankshaft and the block with and without new bearings. Now I explained this in part 1 why these measurements are crucial in a rebuild, as that bearing clearance between those two surfaces are vital in maintaining adequate spaces available for oil to stay suspended in that gap. See, crankshafts are never really touching these bearings, but rather are being suspended by a thin layer of pressurized oil. So these bearing clearances need to be within the manufacturer's specifications to ensure that the crankshaft rotates properly. Now I recorded and wrote down all those measurements and knew that the crankshaft and the block were in good shape, as well as knowing that the new main bearing clearance was within Nissan spec. I then went on to assemble the bottom end of the engine using the stock Nissan torque specs, as well as utilizing plastic gauge to give me a real in-moment measure of what the bearing clearance was. And that measurement came out to be within the Nissan specs. As a result of this checking out correctly, I never second guessed if the torques I had applied were incorrect, as everything checked out according to Nissan's guides. So I continued on with the build. Ultimately, this is how this mistake got by me, as everything had been checking out correctly and nothing had raised a red flag as being an issue. Now, since having discovered this mistake, I have gone back on part 1 and pinned a top comment addressing this issue, what happened and why those measures are wrong. I have also added in there the torque specs from ARP for these main studs and the connecting rod bolts. Now, in a previous version of shooting this video, I did go through and measure all the breakaway torques on these studs, as I was concerned at having put incorrect information out there that you all may be following. I noticed that they were all under the 60 foot-pounds required by ARP, coming anywhere between 50 and 58 foot-pounds, and to be honest, that was a bit of a relief, as I was really concerned with them being over-torqued. So, since I'm going to be swapping this girl for the original setup, I'm going to be readdressing all these torques anyway. Cue the montage. Alright, so that should wrap up all the fixes I wanted to resolve on this, and I am happy to be going back now and fixing these issues before moving on with future projects. Now, one thing I do want to note is that because I'm applying a new torque spec to all these mains, I did do a pass-through with Plastigauge to ensure that all of the bearing clearances were still within the Nissan spec. The main bearing clearance spec for a VQ35DE is between 0.035 millimeters and 0.045 millimeters. All of the Plastigauge measures were reading at about the 0.038 millimeters, so all of the bearing clearances are within spec. Now, another thing I did while having the bottom end open was address the connecting rod torque specs that I had incorrectly applied in the first part of the series. I had applied the stock torque specs to the new upgraded ARP 2000 bolts that I have in here, and those ARP bolts require their own torque specs. So while I was addressing the mains anyway, I wanted to also retorque all of the connecting rod bolts to the 45 foot-pounds required by ARP. Now, if you're following these videos and you applied the stock Nissan torque specs to upgraded ARP hardware, I apologize for providing the incorrect information. I work and aim to do things correctly, and I will research all of these parts and components to ensure that I'm delivering quality, correct information in these videos. In this instance, my double checking of my work actually came out correct, even though the incorrect torques were applied. This created a bit of a blind spot that only later what I realized after the video had been posted was in fact incorrect. I have not meant to display these videos as how-to guides for these engines, but rather I'm sharing my own experience building this engine for my own car and discussing the various parameters and parts about them. I would rather hope that my videos inspire you and others to go tackle your own projects while maybe having a new takeaway about what I'm doing here. If you're building your own VQ35, please follow the guidelines from Nissan in the factory service manual or refer to the instructions that come with your parts to ensure that your builds are correct. Alright, so with that, I'm ready to wrap this all up. Now, the first thing I'm going to be doing is cleaning up the upper and lower oil pans, but before that, I want to mention two important things about RTV. The first thing to note is that a little goes a long way with RTV, and too much can actually become a problem. Like I have here where it's protruding on the inside of the oil pan, this can eventually break off and get circulated around with the oil and really become a problem by blocking those small passageways. So this is why I say a little goes a long way, as a really thin bead all the way around the oil pan is enough to cover that surface. The other point is when I first assembled this, I was using this ultra black gasket maker, and this is a great general purpose RTV, but it lacks some of the complexity and some of the hardness that comes from the actual Nissan RTV. So in this reassembly, I wanted to upgrade to this as it's a lot more robust and generally is a lot better for covering larger areas. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up these oil pans, get them looking brand new, and then hit them with this new RTV. Wrap up all of the fixes I wanted to make to the internals of the engine, but there is one last thing that I want to add on here to the bottom end. Back in part 4, I added this lightweight aluminum crank pulley, and I discussed at the time why I would eventually be ditching this and going to this ATI Damper. The logic of a damper is that it is a heavier mass that sits on the nose of a crankshaft, and they assist in its balance and harmonics. As an engine is going through its firing sequence, each explosion drives a piston down into the crankshaft to make it rotate, but each explosion is having an effect of a small deflection in how that crankshaft rotates. A damper helps by absorbing some of that energy and helps the crankshaft more smoothly rotate. This will also be a really big help considering the much more aggressive camshafts I put into this, along with some of the other upgrades I plan on adding to the top end of the engine. So this is a much needed upgrade. So that completely wraps up all of the fixes and alterations I wanted to make here on the engine. Now I know I didn't apply the torque spec to the damper or apply red Loctite to the outer bolts as specified by ATI, but for now I want to leave that semi-removable in case I do need to pull it off the engine. But other than that, everything is put back together and ready to move forward with the other upgrades that I have for the engine. Now in the next part, I'm going to be tackling a lot here on the top end of the engine with everything from the ignition, the intake, and the fuel delivery system. So definitely stay tuned for what all is to come with that. So thank you so much for watching. I know this was a bit of a different part, but one I still felt was important to include in the series, and hopefully you all enjoyed it. So definitely stay tuned for what all is to come with this, but until then, I'll see you in the next video.